There's a moment most people never talk about. That moment when you're lying in bed at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, and something inside you whispers, "Is this it? Is this really all there is?" Not sadness, not depression, something quieter than that. A hollow feeling, like you've been playing a game your whole life, following the rules, doing what you were supposed to do, and somewhere along the way, you forgot to ask why. Friedrich Nietzsche felt that feeling too, except instead of rolling over and going back to sleep, he did something most people never dare to do. He pulled that feeling out from the dark, held it up to the light, and stared directly at it until it stopped being terrifying and started being interesting. Nietzsche was not a self-help guru. He didn't write 10-step programs. He wasn't trying to make you comfortable. He was trying to wake you up, sometimes violently, sometimes beautifully, always uncomfortably. He lived most of his life in physical pain, without fame, without money, writing books that almost nobody read while he was alive. He died in 1900 after years of mental collapse. And yet, the things he wrote in those quiet, painful years changed the entire direction of Western thought. So what did he actually say? What are the ideas underneath all the famous quotes plastered on motivational posters? Because there's a version of Nietzsche that gets flattened into bumper stickers. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. People say it after a bad breakup or a tough workout and move on. But the real Nietzsche, the one who actually sat down and thought these things through, was saying something far deeper, far stranger, and far more powerful than any bumper sticker could contain. What he was really talking about was a complete transformation of how a human being can live. A new way of relating to suffering, to other people, to your own desires, to failure, to society, to time itself. He called it, in various ways, the philosophy of power. Not power over others, but power over yourself. The ability to become, as he put it, who you truly are. This is not a lecture. This is not an academic rundown of philosophical positions. This is something more like a conversation between his ideas and your life. Because the strange thing about Nietzsche is that the more honestly you read him, the more it feels like he was somehow writing about you, about your specific frustrations, your specific paralysis, your specific hunger for something more. So, let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the one thing Nietzsche understood better than almost anyone who came before him, and the one thing most people are still too afraid to look at directly. In 1882, Nietzsche wrote one of the most provocative sentences in the history of ideas. God is dead. People hear that and they think atheism. They think he was attacking religion, mocking believers, waving a flag for science over faith. But that's a surface reading, a lazy one. What Nietzsche was actually doing was something far more honest and far more unsettling than simple atheism. He was pointing at a collapse. Not just the collapse of religious belief, but the collapse of the entire framework that religious belief had been holding up for thousands of years. The framework that told people, here is what you're worth, here is what your suffering means, here is the reason to be good, to endure, to hope, to resist your worst impulses. Here is the story you are a part of. Here is where you fit. When that framework begins to crumble, and Nietzsche saw clearly that it was crumbling, even in his time, and certainly in ours, something terrifying happens. People are left not with freedom, but with vertigo, with a kind of groundlessness. The rules are gone, but nobody has told them that yet. So they keep following the old rules without the old reasons. They keep performing the old rituals without believing in them. They keep building their lives on foundations they have quietly stopped trusting. And what fills the vacuum? Nietzsche saw it clearly. Comfort-seeking, entertainment, distraction, the herd mentality, following what everyone else does because at least that feels like having a direction. He called the person who fills this vacuum with noise and shallow pleasures the last man, a figure of pure contempt in his philosophy. The last man blinks. The last man says, "We invented happiness." The last man asks for nothing large, risks nothing real, and dies having never truly lived. Here is what makes this relevant to your life. Right now, today, you are living in exactly the world Nietzsche predicted. An ocean of content, of distraction, of micro-pleasures. Every craving can be satisfied instantly. Every uncomfortable silence can be filled with a podcast, a scroll, a video. And yet, quietly, underneath all of it, that hollow feeling persists. The 2 a.m. ceiling staring doesn't go away just because the Netflix catalog keeps expanding. Nietzsche's answer to this wasn't to reconstruct the old framework. He didn't say, go back to religion, go back to tradition, pretend the foundations are still solid. He said something more demanding, more frightening, and ultimately more exhilarating than that. He said, if the old values have collapsed, then you personally, are responsible for creating new ones. Not society, not your parents, not your government or your culture or your ideology. You, the individual, alone with the question, what do I actually believe? What would I actually choose, if I could choose anything, as my highest value? This is what he called the revaluation of all values. And it is the central challenge his philosophy puts before every person who encounters it. Not an intellectual challenge, a lived challenge. The challenge of actually sitting down with your own life and asking, which of these choices are truly mine? Which of these beliefs have I actually examined? Which of these fears am I carrying that were given to me by someone else? And which ones are real? Most people never do this. Most people inherit their values the way they inherit their native language, unconsciously, completely, and without ever realizing there are other languages possible. Nietzsche is not asking you to throw everything out. He's asking you to actually look at what you've got, to hold each piece up to the light and ask, does this strengthen me or does it diminish me? Does this reflect who I am becoming or who I was told to be? That is already an act of enormous courage. Most people never get there, but for those who do, for those who are willing to sit in the discomfort of that open question, something begins to shift. Here is one of the most misunderstood ideas in the history of philosophy. When people hear will to power, they picture domination, control, the ruthless businessman crushing competitors, the dictator with his army, the bully in the schoolyard. This is the reading that got Nietzsche's ideas twisted and weaponized in the 20th century, associated with movements he would have despised and people he explicitly criticized in his own writing. The will to power is not about dominating other people. Here is what Nietzsche actually meant. If you read him carefully, the will to power is the fundamental drive in every living thing to expand, to grow, to overcome. Not to conquer the world, to conquer yourself, to master your own reactions, your own fears, your own laziness, your own small-mindedness, to push against your own edges and become something slightly more than you were yesterday. Think about what this actually looks like in a human life. You decide to learn something genuinely difficult, not because it's practical, not because it will look good on a resume, but because you feel a pull toward it, a desire to stretch your mind in a direction it hasn't gone before. The moment you sit down with that difficulty, when you feel the frustration of not understanding, when you push through that frustration into something like comprehension, that is the will to power, that upward surge, that feeling of expanding past a previous limit. You're in a conversation, and someone says something you disagree with, and the easy thing, the comfortable thing, is to nod along. But something in you refuses. You speak. You articulate your position clearly, even knowing the other person might push back. That small act of intellectual courage, that is the will to power. You've built a habit that is slowly making you smaller. A screen addiction, a pattern of avoidance, a way of numbing yourself that has become automatic. The moment you recognize it for what it is and make a deliberate choice to break it, imperfectly, with setbacks, but deliberately, that is the will to power. Nietzsche believed that human beings are not primarily rational creatures. We are not primarily driven by logic or self-interest, or the desire for pleasure and the avoidance of pain. We are driven by this deeper thing, the desire to become, the hunger for self-transcendence. And when that hunger is blocked, by circumstances, by social pressure, by our own fear, it doesn't disappear. It turns inward. It curdles into resentment, into depression, into the constant low-level suffering of a person who has given up on their own expansion. This is why comfort, paradoxically, can be a form of slow destruction. When everything is easy, when every need is immediately satisfied, when nothing requires genuine effort or genuine risk, the will to power has nothing to push against. And a person with nothing to push against starts to wither, starts to feel, without being able to name it, that something essential is missing. That life has the texture of something processed, smooth and filling and somehow nutritionless. Nietzsche's prescription was not masochism. He wasn't saying, make yourself miserable, pile on suffering, choose the hardest path for its own sake. He was saying something more precise. Seek out the challenges that are genuinely yours, the ones that call to something specific in you, the ones that, when you push against them, make you feel most alive. Suffer the right way, productively, towards something, for something. And the suffering transforms into fuel. The will to power is not about accumulating external achievements. It is not about becoming famous or rich or respected, though those things might come as byproducts. It is about the quality of your internal orientation. Are you facing toward life or away from it? Are you moving forward or standing still? Are you choosing difficulty when difficulty matters, or are you always choosing the exit? That's the question, and the honest answer to it, whatever it is the starting point of everything else. This is perhaps the most demanding idea Nietzsche ever developed. It sounds simple. It translates simply, amor fati, love of fate, love your fate. Embrace what happens to you. Not just accept it, actually love it. When you first hear that, it sounds like a recipe for passivity, like a philosophical excuse to lie down and let the world walk over you. Oh, I lost my job? Amor fati. Oh, my relationship fell apart? Amor fati. Oh, everything is going wrong? Love it, I guess. But that is completely wrong. And understanding why it's wrong is the key to understanding one of the most genuinely useful ideas in the entire history of philosophy. Amor fati is not resignation. It is not passive acceptance. It is not pretending that bad things are actually good, or smiling through genuine suffering in some kind of performative spiritual cosplay, amor. Fati is the recognition that everything that has happened to you, including and especially the worst things, is inseparable from who you are right now. It is the refusal to divide your life into the parts you approve of and the parts you wish had never happened. It is the decision, a real, difficult, ongoing decision, to stop treating your own history as a wound. Think about it this way. There is something in your past that you carry as a weight. Maybe it's a failure, a loss, something done to you that shouldn't have been done, a version of yourself that made choices you're ashamed of. Most people relate to that thing one of two ways. Either they bury it and pretend it didn't happen, or they drag it behind them everywhere they go, unable to fully live in the present because part of them is always back there, in that moment, wishing it had gone differently. Nietzsche is suggesting a third way, not forgetting, not pretending, but integrating, looking at that thing and saying, this happened. It is real. And because it happened, I am the specific, particular, unrepeatable person sitting here now, asking this question. If it hadn't happened, if any of it had been different, I would not be this person. And this person, with all their cracks and complications and hard-won understanding, this person is the material I have to work with. This person is who I actually am. The love in amor fati is not the easy, comfortable love of things that feel good. It is the fierce, defiant love of a craftsman for their material, even when the material is difficult, uneven, resistant. A sculptor doesn't hate the stone for being hard. The hardness is what makes sculpture possible. The resistance is what gives the work its form. This is Nietzsche's vision of the properly oriented human life. Not a smooth, comfortable trajectory from pleasure to pleasure, but a shaping, a struggle, a dynamic relationship between a person and the resistance that reality constantly offers them. The goal is not the elimination of hardship, but the development of a self that can meet hardship without being destroyed by it. A self that can, over time, learn to love what it once merely endured. There's a practical dimension to this too, one that often gets missed in the philosophical discussions. Most of the suffering in human life is not caused by what actually happens. It is caused by the gap between what happens and what we think should happen. The expectation versus the reality. The mental image of how life was supposed to go, crashing against the stubborn fact of how it actually went. Nietzsche's philosophy, in a very direct sense, is an attack on that gap. Not by lowering your expectations into passivity, but by changing your relationship to outcomes, by developing the capacity to want what you get as well as get what you want. This is incredibly difficult. Nobody achieves it completely. Nietzsche himself didn't live it perfectly. His letters are full of frustration, of loneliness, of bitterness about being ignored by the world. But he held the ideal clearly and articulated it with a precision that has helped millions of people since reorient their relationship to their own history. And here is the deepest version of it. Nietzsche connected amor fati to what he called the eternal recurrence, a thought experiment so radical it's worth spending time on, because it might be the most useful tool he ever devised for clarifying what you actually want from your life. Imagine this, not as a fantasy, not as a metaphor, as literally as you can manage. Imagine that after you die, your life, your exact life, every moment of it, every decision, every feeling, every joy, and every humiliation begins again, from the beginning, and plays out in exactly the same way. Forever. Not a similar life, not a better version. This life, this specific, imperfect, unrepeatable sequence of moments, again and again, for eternity, without change and without end. The first reaction most people have to this idea is horror. What? This again? Forever. And Nietzsche knows that. He introduces the idea in The Gay Science through a strange little parable. A demon who whispers this thought to you in your loneliest moment and asks, "What is your reaction? Is this thought the most terrifying thing you've ever imagined? Or can you conceive of a way of living in which your response would be, yes, again, once more, I want this?" Nietzsche was not claiming this is literally true, that the universe actually does recycle human lives in an infinite loop. He was using the idea as a kind of stress test for the way you're living, a philosophical pressure chamber. Because if the idea of living your life again, exactly as you've lived it, fills you with despair, then something important is revealed about the choices you're making right now. Think about the things you're doing that you don't want to do, the path you're on because someone else put you on it, the version of yourself you present to the world versus the version you are when no one's watching, the thing you keep meaning to start and never do, the relationship you're maintaining out of inertia, the dream you've been postponing for years under the banner of when things settle down. Would you want to do all of that again? Forever? If the answer is no, and for most people, for most parts of their lives, the honest answer is no, then the eternal recurrence is pointing directly at the thing that needs to change. Not tomorrow, not when things settle down. Now. This is what Nietzsche means when he talks about living more fully, more intentionally, more yours. Not a hedonistic maximization of pleasure, not a bucket list, something more essential than that. The alignment between the life you are living and the life you would be willing to live again. Not every moment. Life contains unavoidable boredom and frustration and waiting. But the overall arc, the general direction, the fundamental orientation of your choices. The eternal recurrence asks the question that almost nothing else in daily life forces you to face. Is this really how you want to spend your one shot at existence? And it asks it without letting you hide behind vague future plans. Because in the thought experiment, the future is already the same as the present. There is no later. There is only this, repeated forever. For some people, this thought is paralyzing. For others, for the ones who let it land fully, who sit with it long enough to feel its weight, it becomes the most clarifying thing they have ever encountered. A sudden burning away of everything peripheral, everything comfortable, everything inherited and unexamined. What remains after that burning is something more genuinely personal. A clearer sense of what actually matters, of what you would actually choose if you were really choosing. That clarity, once it comes, is a kind of power. Let's address this directly, because it is one of the most misread, misused, and abused concepts in all of philosophy. The Übermensch, the Overman, the Superman, the concept that was twisted beyond recognition by people Nietzsche himself despised, used to justify things he explicitly argued against in his own books, and reduced in popular culture to a kind of fantasy of ruthless domination. The real Übermensch is something far stranger, far humbler, and far more interesting than any of that. Nietzsche introduces the concept in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and the first thing Zarathustra says, the thing Nietzsche clearly wants us to notice, is that human beings are not the end point of anything. They are a middle, a transition, a tightrope stretched over an abyss between the animal and something beyond the animal, something not yet achieved, something that doesn't exist yet, but that can begin to exist in individual human beings who commit to a certain kind of self-overcoming. The Übermensch is not a type of person you recognize from the outside. It is not about physical strength or wealth or intelligence or status. It is entirely an inner achievement, a way of relating to your own life. Concretely, the Übermensch is the person who has done the work of confronting their own values and honestly remaking them, who has passed through Nietzsche's 3 metamorphoses, the stages of transformation that Zarathustra describes in one of the most beautiful passages in the book. The first metamorphosis is the camel. The camel is the spirit of burden-bearing, of duty, of carrying what is placed on you without question. The camel kneels down and says, "Load me up. Give me the heaviest things. Give me your rules, your expectations, your thou shalts. I will carry them." This is the spirit of the diligent student, the faithful employee, the person who does what is asked of them without complaint. It has genuine value. It builds strength, but it is not yet freedom. The second metamorphosis is the lion. The lion turns the camel's burden-carrying into rebellion. It looks at the great dragon, the dragon that says thou shalt on every scale, and it says, "I will." Not, "You say I must," but "I choose." The lion is the spirit of refusal, of setting boundaries, of standing up to inherited obligations that no longer serve you. This is necessary. This is courage. But the lion, for all its strength, can only say no. It cannot yet create. It cannot yet give new values to the world. The third metamorphosis is the child. The child is the spirit of new beginning, of play, of creation from a place of innocence, not the innocence of ignorance, but the innocence on the other side of experience. The child can say yes to life in a way the lion cannot, because the child is not defined by what it rebels against. The child creates new games, new values, new meaning. This is what Nietzsche means by the Übermensch. Not a finished state, but this orientation, this creative, life-affirming, self-overcoming relationship to existence. The reason this matters practically is simple. Most people never leave the camel stage. Most people live their entire lives carrying other people's burdens without ever asking whether those burdens are theirs to carry. The lion moment, the moment of genuine rebellion, of saying, "This is not actually what I want," is terrifying for most people. Because the lion, for a moment, has nothing. It has rejected the old, but has not yet found the new. There is a void between the camel and the child, and most people feel that void and retreat back into burden-carrying, because at least that is familiar. Nietzsche's invitation is to not retreat, to stay in the discomfort of the lion's freedom long enough to arrive, eventually, at the child's creativity, to find, on the other side of all that inherited weight, something that is genuinely and specifically yours. That is the Übermensch, not a superhuman with extraordinary powers, a person who has done the extraordinary work of becoming, honestly and completely, themselves. This is perhaps the most controversial idea Nietzsche developed, and also the most misunderstood. Let's approach it carefully, because when you actually understand what he's saying, stripped of all the ugly interpretations that have been piled on top of it, it reveals something genuinely illuminating about how human psychology and culture actually work. Nietzsche looked at the history of morality and saw two fundamentally different ways that human beings have organized their values. He called them, bluntly, master morality and slave morality. Master morality, in his account, begins with the self. The person with a master morality starts by asking, "What is good? What do I value? What represents excellence, strength, creativity, generosity, vitality?" From there, they define what is bad, not evil, just bad, weak, petty, mediocre. This is a value system that flows outward from a confident inner source. It is affirmative. It starts with yes. Slave morality, by contrast, begins with the other, with the enemy, with the thing that threatens or oppresses or dominates. The person with a slave morality starts by asking, "What is evil?" pointing at the powerful, the confident, the free, and then defines good as whatever is opposite to that evil. Humility instead of pride, meekness instead of strength, patience instead of action, suffering instead of joy. This is a value system that flows from resentment, from the experience of powerlessness. It is reactive. It starts with no. Now, and this is crucial, Nietzsche is not simply saying, masters good, slaves bad. He is not endorsing the literal domination of one group of people over another. He is making a psychological and cultural observation, not a political prescription. And the observation is this: most modern morality, regardless of what it claims about itself, is built on the psychological foundations of slave morality. The deep structure of much contemporary moral culture is reactive. It begins with identifying what is wrong, what is harmful, what must be controlled or punished or shamed. It is organized around prohibition and resentment, rather than around affirmation and creation. And Nietzsche's point is that a culture organized around resentment, no matter how sophisticated its justifications, produces a certain kind of human being, one who defines themselves by what they're against rather than what they're for, one who experiences the freedom and excellence of others as a threat rather than an inspiration. The practical implication of this for an individual life is this: which way does your own value system flow? When you make a choice, are you choosing toward something you genuinely want? Or are you choosing against something you resent? When you evaluate other people, are you starting from a clear sense of what you find genuinely admirable? Or are you starting from a catalog of what you find offensive and threatening? When you set a goal, is it an expression of something you actually want to create in the world? Or is it a reaction to someone else's success that made you feel small? None of this is black and white. Human psychology is layered and complicated, and almost everyone has both orientations operating simultaneously. But Nietzsche's challenge is to notice which one is dominant, to catch yourself in the moments of reactive resentment and ask, is this really the center of gravity I want to live from? Or can I find my way back to a more affirmative, more generative, more genuinely mine starting point? The shift from slave morality to master morality, in Nietzsche's terms, is not about becoming arrogant or dismissive of others. It is about relocating the source of your values, moving it from outside, from the judgment of others, from cultural pressure, from competitive resentment, to inside, building a self that knows what it actually values and moves toward those values with something like joy. That is what he calls life affirmation. And it is, in his view, the rarest and most important achievement available to a human being. Nietzsche called himself, at various points, a philosopher with a hammer. This is one of those phrases that sounds more violent than he actually meant it. The hammer he was talking about was not a weapon for breaking things down out of nihilistic rage. It was more like a physician's reflex hammer, the tool a doctor uses to tap your knee and check whether the nerves are responding correctly. Nietzsche was tapping at the foundations of Western thought and culture, checking what was genuinely solid and what was hollow. A lot of what sounded solid when he tapped it turned out to be hollow. And he said so. What does this mean for a life? It means that part of the work of becoming who you are is necessarily destructive. Not destructive of other people. Destructive of the illusions you've been maintaining about yourself. The stories you've been telling yourself about why you haven't done the thing you want to do. The self-images that protect you from certain truths. The comfortable half-truths that keep you from having to make difficult choices. Nietzsche did not believe in comfortable philosophy. He believed that real philosophical thinking, real engagement with these ideas, should cost you something. Should disturb you. Should leave you, at least temporarily, less certain than you were before. Because certainty that has never been tested is not wisdom. It is just unexploded inheritance. There is something in your life right now, probably several things, that you know, if you're honest, need to be examined with the philosopher's hammer. Not because they're wrong, necessarily, but because you've never actually checked. You've just assumed, the assumption that you know what you want from your career. The assumption that the relationships you maintain are still actually serving the person you're becoming. The assumption that the version of success you're chasing is one you actually chose, rather than absorbed from the environment you grew up in. The assumption that the fears guiding your decisions are based on reality, rather than on very old experiences that may no longer apply. Tap any of those assumptions. Really tap them. Hold them up to the question, does this actually hold? Do I actually believe this? Is this mine? Some of them will hold. Some of them will ring hollow. And the ones that ring hollow, those are the places where the real work is. Not comfortable work, but real work. Work that actually changes the shape of a life. Nietzsche's philosophy is, at bottom, an invitation to that work. An insistence that a life unlived in this way, a life of unexamined inherited values and comfortable avoidances, is a life not quite fully yours, and that you are capable of something more than that, something harder and stranger and more alive. There is one final phrase from Nietzsche that I want to leave you with. It's the subtitle of one of his most personal works, Ecce Homo. He wrote it at the end of his philosophical career, shortly before his collapse. It was his attempt to explain himself, his books, his mission, his strange and painful life. And the subtitle he gave it was this: How One Becomes What One Is. Not how one achieves success. Not how one becomes powerful in the ordinary sense. Not how one gets what one wants, how one becomes what one is. There is a version of you, not a perfect version, not a finished version, not a version without flaws or contradictions or ongoing difficulties, but a version of you that is genuinely and specifically and unmistakably yours. A version that has examined its own values rather than inherited them blindly. A version that can meet suffering without being broken by it. A version that moves towards something it actually chose rather than away from things it has been told to fear. A version that could face the eternal recurrence and say, with something approaching equanimity, yes, this, again. Getting to that version is not a weekend project. It is the project of a life. It requires the courage of the lion, the willingness to refuse what doesn't fit, and the creativity of the child, the ability to build something new in the space that refusal opens up. It requires amor fati, not the passive acceptance of whatever happens, but the fierce commitment to making meaning from it regardless. It requires the will to power directed inward, not at dominating others, but at expanding past your own previous limits. It is, in the end, what Nietzsche's entire philosophy was pointing toward. Not a system of rules, not a set of instructions, a direction, an orientation, a way of turning to face your own life, the specific, complicated, unrepeatable life you have, and choosing it. Not because it is easy, not because it is comfortable, not because someone told you to, but because it is yours. And that, in Nietzsche's world, is the only thing that has ever really mattered.